Hi, welcome to live at Let's Talk Leadership. This is our first attempt to have a live conversation. Joining me today are Brit and Ian, who you will have met perhaps on other conversations, and also Anne and Ira, who are two friends of ours. Ira is calling in from Holland, and Anne is down in West London. So we're going to have a conversation this morning. It's live, so if you want to join us on LinkedIn, in the chat and ask a question, or if you want to, if you're following us on YouTube and you want to use the chat function on YouTube, then just put a comment, and Richard, who is the producer behind all of this, will pick up the comments and then feed them into our conversation. But it's great to have this opportunity. It's something new for us at Let's Talk Leadership, and we hope you enjoy it. It's very organic. We're just going to take it wherever it goes, and as I say, if there are questions you want to ask, just feel free to ask them. So, everyone, just a thought. The challenges that leaders are facing at the moment are huge, and so I wanted to just sort of chuck into the conversation the importance of trust, because with what's going on in the United States at the moment, in politics there, what's happening in politics in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, maybe the challenges that the young are giving the older generations about looking after the environment, climate change. We've got the pandemic, so we've got people challenging the science that's on our televisions and challenging the decisions that are being made, and can we trust the data? And it just seemed to me that in the conversations I've had with one or two senior leaders in organizations recently, this whole issue about when our teams are working away from us, when they're working in isolation, how do we trust them? How do they trust us? So I just wanted to chuck that out and just get a reaction, because it seems to me to be really, really critical at the moment.
So this is where we need to respond. Is that right, Matthew? So
well, you can sit there.
Well, I think an example of that is University of Manchester in Great Britain. Today we heard that the students woke up to barricades or fencing right around the main campus. And I think, however much they might have felt they were being kept safe, it felt like their liberty was being taken away. And I think, one of the things we know about crisis is there's huge hardship in it, but we do need to balance being authoritarian with being collaborative.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just interested in the collaborative piece, because we talk about it a lot. We talk about interdependency, but I just noticed that at the moment, leaders just in any walk of life, a lot of them just go off and do their own thing. I'd be really interested in how many of the leaders that we know actually call each other at the moment and discuss what's happening in their organizations with the pandemic, or with the economic problems that are going to face us, or the unemployment that's rising. It'd be really interesting to know, because I don't get a sense that they do that.
No, I think there is a tendency, especially in crisis times, to become more inward looking, whether that's inside your own country or inside your own party or whatever, but you become more inward looking and more suspicious towards the outside world. And to your point, Matthew, of leaders talking together, I saw that the French president, Emmanuel Macron, was thinking of sending an envoy to the Middle East in order to help explain his position on values and freedom of speech and freedom of religion and that kind of thing. And I thought that could be an example of how leaders sometimes do need to step up and reach out and think, hang on a minute, if they don't understand me, maybe I am part of that misunderstanding, and maybe I can help to bring people together by simply explaining rather than shouting.
Yeah.
I think that's one of we're talking about behaviors. I think that reinventing and not retreating is really critical, not just surviving, but thriving going forward. So, how you can engage your network and, of course, your workforce, most importantly, in taking the threat of COVID and making it into an opportunity, I think is hugely important.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good point, Anne. And I think there's something about individuals, leaders, emerging leaders, I think perhaps all of us, in fact, how we all manage anxiety, because there's a lot of fear at the moment, which I think we'd all recognize. So I think firstly, it's about acknowledging and paying attention to those fears that we have and those feelings that we have about uncertainty and how we can cope, what the future will bring. We have these extraordinary circumstances politically, with the pandemic, things we've never really encountered before, at least not for a century. And so firstly, I think it's kind of how do we notice and help others notice how we're responding? And I think linked to that, there's something about a need for certainty. So I think that's why, a lot of people are looking to leaders for answers when in fact it's very hard to find meaningful answers. So I think that's kind of a starting point, A, to notice, and then B, to recognize that, in fact, there isn't really a certainty. It's how do we actually, try and move forward as best we can without there actually being a right or wrong answer to most questions, in fact.
If these are symptoms, Ira, of this world that we live in right now, what are the communication skills that the leaders across the world, whether you're a senior executive, whether you're an emerging young leader with their first team, whether you're a political leader somewhere, is how do you communicate? And we've seen in recent times a very different switch to different mechanisms to communicate from using Twitter, which we are very familiar with. But for some of the leaders in business now, it's what's the mechanism now? Because leading by walking around, seeing your people, having those corridor conversations, it's just so much harder, I think, for people to connect in the moment.
Yes.
And if your team are very busy, which they probably are, working on their tasks and their areas of responsibility, interrupting them constantly to have Zoom calls like we're having right now, and being live online is a major disruption, but it's crucial. So how do you get the balance to, because all these things result in trust, or maybe a lack of trust, and of course anxiety as well.
Yes.
So I'm fascinated about the way that people are communicating right now, and I think if you look at the basics of leadership, it's dialing up some of the things that you do naturally, but doing it more often, maybe in shorter bursts, but making sure that there are not big gaps in the conversation.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes, I find that with my coaching work, for example, and probably you do as well. Actually, simply creating some time and space to allow things to emerge is really helpful, and people really appreciate that. And sometimes I wonder if leaders might underestimate the value of simply creating an environment in which individuals can express their concerns or how they're coping. Because I think a lot of people, as you say, Ian, are under so much pressure. The boundaries between work and home are much more blurred than ever before. And so it might feel like it's a waste of time to create some space just to say, well, how are you managing? How are you getting on? Because your approach to coping might be different to mine, and that's all fine. But it's actually creating that opportunity so people can express A, their concerns, and B, how they're coping, and also learning from others and what approaches they're using to cope with the current situation.
I've also noticed that personality is maybe slightly easier to see in this situation too, because we talk about the polarity of introversion versus extroversion, maybe as a need or a preference around personality, pure personality. And of course, for some people, this is excruciatingly difficult to live in this 100% virtual world for many people. For others, it's much more natural and in a place of their strengths as a personality type. So I'm fascinated by that. But my wife, it's Friday, right? Is it Friday? It's been a short week, it seems, this week. But on a Friday, every couple of weeks, they have a virtual kind of drink session. So they do grab, it could be a coffee, it could be a beer or whatever. And towards the end of the day, they get together. But they make that time and space just to kick back, reflect on the week, as you would do going out for a coffee or a beer at the end of the week. So it's a nice way to introduce some of that safe space for people just to kick back a little bit.
Yeah. And in a social setting, that's what we do. That's how we connect with each other. But in a professional setting, I think you're right, Ira. It's quite difficult to allocate the time to ask people how they're really getting on. And I think that gets back to the original bias that we have, that many companies have around the touchy-feely sort of, well, I have no time to have a cup of tea with you and ask how you are. We've got a list of KPIs. We've got to sort of hit our targets. And I think that's now being called into question as we realize that the touchy-feely is actually the basis on which to trust each other.
Although, interestingly, some research from a group of coaches that I've been working with closely, obviously it's not written up, but just from their experiences, that the people who seem to self-report, the managers and leaders self-report as being more successful during the crisis, are those who focus on task rather than process and relationships. So, maybe they found it easier to just have a focus and think, right, let's get out there. Whereas the difficulty of building relationships is very real, even if you know them. Particularly think about the new people. who didn't even have the relationships and have joined companies post-COVID. And also seeing, you know, that relationship aspect to winning new work with one of my clients. The normal channels that you would use for winning new work just aren't really there. You can't just pop and have a drink with someone. I mean, we can do what you said, Ian, but that's more difficult when you don't know someone and you feel like you've got the added pressure of, you know, can I see if we can make something of this, rather than just ticking along with someone and building a relationship. I think that's jolly hard, really. And yet we need that innovation and the new relationships for the post-COVID world.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed this. You know, two family members, and my daughter's partner Dave was saying that, you know, he's just added 2 new people to the team that he looks after, but they've joined virtually. You know, the whole onboarding of them, settling them in, making sure they've got what they need, understanding the culture of the organization, all the things that you might do in a different world, are suddenly very, very much more difficult. And my niece Tamsin, who's a follower of what we're doing, she took on a new role, a very senior new role, working with the Home Office recently. And, you know, she said, again, a lot of that, the interview, the conversations, the onboarding, all had to be done at a distance. And when you're trying to either improve your communication or build trust, or you're trying to work differently, and maybe it doesn't come naturally to you to sort of just let people get on with what they're doing. You know, you feel you do need to be in touch with them. You may have concerns. It does add a whole new element, I think, around communication, around trust, around this, how you maintain the socializing without overdoing it. I've had a lot of feedback, certainly with the clients I've been working with recently, where people saying we just get straight into work every time. You know, the corridor conversations, the chat while we're waiting for someone else to join the meeting, getting out of our car in the car park and meeting someone on site for something, all of that's gone. It's just straight into work. It's a Zoom call, or it's a, you know, Microsoft Teams call. That's it. Job done, on to the next thing. And for leadership, I think I don't know, I just sense it's really tough, really difficult to get it right. And the point you made, Ira, everyone's looking for, you know, certainty. I mean, I dread that word. You hear it on the news all the time, business leaders saying, we want certainty from the government, expecting the poor souls in any government to be able to have a clarity that the rest of us haven't got. And it just is really difficult, really difficult.
Isn't that what Bob Johansson, the futurologist, refers to as clarity rather than certainty? Seek clarity rather than certainty?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, I mean, and we've seen it even certainly in the UK. Just yesterday, the government put in more financial support, and straight away people were challenging it and asking, well, does that mean the pandemic isn't going to finish, or isn't going to be dealt with, or we haven't got a vaccine because you've extended the financial arrangement through, you know, March next year? And it's straight away the communication issue. How does a leader, how do you get that message across that's clear, the clarity piece, without committing to something you can't possibly commit to because you just don't know?
Yeah,
because it's a great example of lack of trust, isn't it? We immediately think of the negative aspect of, I hadn't actually heard that, Matthew, but it's like, oh, as soon as you said it, I'm like, yeah, I suppose that could be. That makes me feel worse, not better. I'm not thinking, great, we've got a package. I'm thinking, how will we ever pay it back? We're doing quantitative easing, and perhaps they're lying to us about what it's going to end on.
And it goes back to your point as well, Anne, what you said with what was going on at the University of Manchester. People waking up and seeing a fence, their first thought was probably not, oh, that's wonderful, they're protecting us. But, oh my God, we're being held prisoners. That's the negative that we go to, and that seems to be even more of a reflex when we are in crisis mode.
Yeah, exactly, Brit. And I think it goes back to your point as well that you mentioned about Emmanuel Macron. I think it's kind of shared responsibility. So that story about University of Manchester and the halls of residence in Fallowfield, you know, I mean, there's no communication from the university about why they were putting up the fences. And apparently it was to ensure their safety. And so I think it causes doubt to be felt amongst both parties, because, you know, there's perhaps a loss of credibility amongst the authorities, because people start to doubt ever more the messages that come from authorities. We have social media, which is part of our reality these days. You know, we live in our echo chambers, and so we retreat to our position and we point to the others who are at fault in our view. And I think the pandemic and all the uncertainty just sort of exacerbates that natural tendency, which is to kind of attribute perhaps bad intent to others. Not always, of course, but I think that tendency is kind of made worse at the moment. So I think it's starting with maybe even mindset as well as skills to think about, well, how am I making sense of the situation? And in our busy everyday lives, you don't really take that time to revisit data or revisit our assumptions because there's so much pressure at work, there's so much pressure outside of work, people have pressure at home. So now you're asking me to kind of, go back to the data. I mean, it's, we're asking a lot of leaders, but I think, in this situation, it's a chance for us to really think about, how we lead others and lead ourselves. So I think it's firstly recognizing this is what's going on and then thinking about what can we do about it.
But the challenge then is we can't provide the certainty as a leader in many situations, but we can help with clarity given what we know and what we don't know. It comes back to trust being formed through very effective communication, and maybe again dialing it up to be more explicit and over communicating the same points, making sure the narrative is clear, but it doesn't escape the fact that some people may not believe what's being said.
Right.
Terms like, wonderful terms we've heard in recent years, fake news, alternative facts, and things like this. Of course, now it's out there, so people are always very suspicious, particularly if it's good news. One of the positives that I think is certainly in my experience in recent months is the way that we find it, I find it easier to connect with some people in my network that maybe I haven't reached out to in a while. And I would encourage any leader who's either struggling with a topic or a young leader who's trying to, just to get some support, some guidance. We talked about coaching and mentoring, but there are many people out there actually who quite quickly can beam in literally into your screen if you have a great network. And I've been amazed and delighted by the support that many of myself and Brit and Matthew and in fact all of us have got from people, even people that write books like on my bookshelf behind and reaching out to the authors. They are so willing to communicate and talk to you and to share their wisdom. And I've just, there's been an opportunity for doing more of that maybe in these last few months. And so use the resources that you have and get some advice and guidance from those people would be my advice.
Yeah, that's a good advice. And I think to that point, I think maybe for young people in leadership positions or aspiring to have leadership positions, that is slightly easier for them to do because they're so much more into the social media than the senior leaders. Yeah.
I think also that there's I don't know, perhaps it's my age, but I think also there's a need to use as wide a range of communication routes as you can. I was laughing this morning because I've seen a whole mass of communication in our family. It's all being done on WhatsApp, endless comments backwards and forwards. And I said at one point, why don't they just pick up the phone and talk to each other? I think one of the aspects, I hope it's not age, but one of the aspects with new technology is everyone dives into it and forgets that actually on occasion, the old technology is pretty good. So to give you an example, actually writing a letter occasionally, particularly when we're all in isolation, is a very, very much more personal thing to do. And it arrives on the doorstep and you open it and you know that someone has personally written it. They've taken the time to think about it. Okay, I'm not saying we go back to letter writing and quills and sitting at high stools sort of filling in ledgers, but making the odd phone call, sending something to someone occasionally, a little present or something that some note or something you've picked up that you think might be of interest. Really, really important. Takes nothing, costs nothing, but it actually, in reality, but it actually makes that human connection. And I think the other thing that I picked up again with some participants the other week, one of them had been brilliant at achieving results, absolutely fantastic. This particular person was well known. If you gave this person a task, they and the team would achieve it. And being isolated and not being able to see the team, she actually admitted it. She got quite concerned that she was getting very stressed about whether things were being achieved in the way she wanted them to, until one of her colleagues said, have you just thought about letting go a bit? Why fight for 100% when probably 90% will do, or even 85% on occasions, whatever the percentage is? Have you asked sort of coaching style questions as opposed to checking up on people? And she said, having had that conversation, it totally changed the way she felt. Totally changed it. And she relaxed a little bit. Stuff was still getting done, but the stress, her personal stress of sitting in isolation, had changed a great deal. And people opened up to her more because she was asking them the sort of coaching questions, which is one of the things we started this conversation about.
That's a great story, Matthew. Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating listening to it, you know, because it wasn't nothing I triggered. It was just her speaking about how she felt.
Yeah, and what I take from that personally, and I think we'll all take, you know, something maybe that we would share or something more individual. What I take from it is focusing less on ourselves and more on others. You know, so it's about, you know, this is a way of coping with the current situation and all the uncertainty or the anxiety. You know, we naturally retreat to ourselves. I think Brit, you made a similar point earlier. So it's how do we focus on others? How could we be generous towards others? And I think to your point, Ian, about reaching out to authors of books who are very willing to share, and happy that you've been in touch with them and are happy to help out. So it's reaching out to others and takes the pressure off oneself. And people will remember that. I think in the current situation, people will remember how they are treated by others, you know, in the longer term. So, you know, so I think it's, you know, asking the question, in the current situation, am I focusing more on myself or am I focusing a little bit more on others? And I think it's an interesting sort of dichotomy to consider.
Yeah, and I think there's research to back up that when you do that, when you do consciously pay more attention to what's going on around you, pay and support others, that actually that backfires in a very positive way. It doesn't backfire, but it has a positive effect of making you feel better as well.
And I have to mention this because Brit gave me the book, but I literally last night finished Frans de Waal's book, The Age of Empathy. He's a primatologist living in the States, but he's Dutch. And the whole book is about how in the animal world, empathy has existed for time immemorial, that we tend to assume that as humans that we're somehow superior. But endless pieces of research of studying primates, monkeys, dogs, elephants, you name it. And deep down, genetically wired into us is empathy. You know, it is, and we talk about it as being a human need, but it's actually a need everywhere. And even to the point where as he points out, in groups of chimpanzees where there's a hierarchy, the alpha male will still share food with a female or another male, even if they're way down in if they believe that animal needs food, if they're not getting the food, you know. So even in structures where you think there's quite a hierarchy, in the animal kingdom, the empathy coming through is huge. It's a wonderful book. I just think, you know, it's like so many things. Ian introduced the idea of books, but it's a fabulous book. But it does make the point that inherent within us, just genetically wired into us, is empathy. And there's very few of us who actually don't take notice or don't understand when someone else is perhaps needing a bit of help or support. And as you say, Ira, if we show it, if we express it, it has an enormous impact on people's well-being. Enormous, huge.
Can I ask a question to you just for a minute, team? So is it possible, do you think, that in this virtual world, if we do just think about ourselves for a moment as leaders, can we reinvent ourselves a little bit more easily in this virtual world? So if we want to become more empathetic and demonstrate that, would it be easier maybe than going back into the same office day after day to actually try and do that more virtually with less risk of failure, and to try different things, to try different approaches? Do you think that's possible?
I think so. I mean, I had another participant the other week said he was asked the question by a colleague, you know, what's put a smile on your face during the pandemic? And his response was not having to drive 3.5 hours to work and back each day. You know, I've got time to focus on the more important things than getting stressed out in traffic, driving to locations. And someone else said, the opportunity to take our children to school in the morning, you know, and there were genuine smiles. And so someone else then said, well, how do we stop ourselves from going back to pre-pandemic behaviors when everyone on this screen, and there were about 15, 16 people on the screen like we've got now, all smiling about things that they were doing differently, which had had a positive impact on them. But you're right, Ian. How do we capture those sort of things and just do things differently?
Yeah, so you have maybe more flexibility around being the person you want to be, and the balance of work and life, and the example you just gave, and also the way you show up. The way that I was going to say you comb your hair, not applicable to me, but the way that you dress, the way that you stage your background, the way that you show up, turn up, the energy that you put into things, and how much interaction you're willing to have. I just wonder if it's not necessarily desirable, it's definitely an opportunity to experiment maybe with the interface, with the approach. And going back to Matthew's point around different types of mechanisms to communicate, social media and live online, like we're doing right now, to get a different blend of those things, and then take that forward into the future, post any type of COVID restriction type of society that we live in right now. How could we get the best of both in the future would be, I think, a real opportunity.
Yeah, and I think a lot of young people, especially, are expecting this as well. They don't want to follow in the same footsteps as their parents or more senior leaders, for example. And I think this reinvention, Ian, to your question, I think can happen not only at an individual level, but also at an organizational level, and indeed at a societal level. So here in the Netherlands, sometimes the air quality isn't that wonderful, but people notice now because there's less traffic, at least earlier in the pandemic, and so the air is cleaner, and so people have the experience, which I think is really key to bringing about change. So they have the experience of how things can be different. So I can use my time more effectively. I can have more time with my family, more time, with rebuilding relationships with people who perhaps I lost touch with in the past. So I think people would be disappointed, and even up to the planet level in a way, if we don't use this opportunity to consider, societal issues as well as issues for ourselves individually. So I think it's reinvention, and there's an expectation and a necessity as well to do this.
I hope so. Yeah.
So.
Well, I think this has been great fun. I don't know what the four of you feel, but I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope anyone who has been watching or will watch this in the future will, even if they haven't been able to do it live, will at least challenge some of the things we've been saying, or add their comments on LinkedIn or on YouTube, because it'd be great to hear from everyone.
We've got a couple of comments on YouTube.
Great.
I'm not sure if my voice is streaming. I've got a mic issue at the moment. We'll work this out later on. But we've got a comment from Tim Hill, who mentions Bob Johansson's book, I think, or Bob Johansson, means being clear on what you're not clear about, smiley face. And then he was also saying, I was talking to an L&D professional yesterday who told me that a more humanistic approach from their managers has emerged this year, but it's disappearing now. What do you think?
Right. Interesting. So that speaks to the point that you were making, Ian, and you are about, actually also, Anne, with the research that you mentioned, that's also quite interesting. Any reflections on Tim's comment?
I think it's a great book that Tim's referring to there as well, and Bob's quite right. You have to be clear on what you don't know, or what you're not clearly understanding, and be clear about those bits too. Otherwise, people see right through your message. Yeah. But the second point, I think, is it's fascinating. Yeah, it's the is it maybe the cycle that we go through, that some of the benefits that we could enjoy initially. And then even the research, Anne, about the task. Of course, you always have to have a task, but you also need, as Brit was saying, to have that space. And maybe the pendulum has swung a bit too much to task all of a sudden, because results have to be. Maybe the space and the ability to forgive through a lower performance, less efficiency, may now have been drying up a little bit, and it's getting a bit tougher out there, less forgiving.
Yeah. Maybe. So I suppose we are also talking about maybe swing back to surviving, aren't we? And people's need to protect themselves and their families. And you hear that horrendous situation in Wales of a family that lost 3 members in 5 days, and it's just so heart-wrenching. And people are willing to criticize and say, this didn't happen to you, it wasn't COVID. Everybody's experience is different. And I think what I'd like to say is that with the empathy bit is to hold on to it. And, as Brit was saying, keep in there and don't retreat, because actually, this second wave, I think people are very tired. And, how do you keep in there and look after yourself, but equally reach out, as we've been saying, and continue to be empathetic to others and understand their perspective, and continue to be interdependent, and not, it's that balance, isn't it, between being independent and looking after yourself and your own, and the importance of that, and just the human quality of that, but also making sure that you don't lose relationships with other people, because we all need one another, and we'll need to build this collaborative, interdependent world again. So
My God,
hugely important.
So Tim's just sort of he got his question clarified a little bit better. So the question is how to embed behaviours they were trying to push last year, which came up naturally and then disappeared, or sort of earlier this year, I would guess, in the middle of this year. How do we embed behaviours they were trying to push last year, which came up naturally and then disappeared?
I think perhaps one of the things is to focus on when those behaviours were being expressed, whether it was by a senior leader or colleague or whatever. How did you get it into a conversation about how did you feel personally? How did your mood change? How did you feel more connected? Did it help you get some balance into what might otherwise have been quite a stressful situation? And then look at and therefore, what were the outcomes in terms of work, in terms of what people achieved? I mean, to give you one example, Michael West produced some data the other day in a talk he was giving to Glanbia, one of CCL's clients, where he showed the actual data where if people were caring and being supportive and focusing on the patient, in one of the surveys, I think it was in the States or in Canada, something like 51% of people spent less time in hospital. GP surgeries had less time spent because people were feeling better as a result of the communication they'd had with their doctor or with their nurse. Health costs had come down dramatically in terms of the use of painkillers because people were feeling, as a result of the care and the attention they'd had and the personal treatment, the empathy, the compassion, the kindness, healthcare costs had come down significantly. And so maybe, to Tim's point, capture what it was that people were doing differently earlier in the year, and try and actually identify how people felt, and then look at the impact on them and their relationships with others around them, and what they then were able to achieve in the workplace. Because certainly and we can share the data because Michael's been happy to do it. He's had conversations with Anne twice on leadership. We can share the data. It is absolutely fascinating.
Guys, it's a wonderful conversation. I'm just looking forward to continuing it, but I do have to go now. So thank you all, and look forward to what's coming and what the next steps are.
And thanks for joining us. It's been great.
And me too. Keep well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And Richard, are there any other comments at the moment?
Probably not.
No, apologies everybody. Just the layout's gone a bit funny, but we're just fixing that now. And yeah, so there's no other comments at the moment. Although Tim did follow up on that, and just said the pendulum swung the other way, like Ian has said. So just trying to fix everything at the moment.
As you're doing that, Richard, is it possible then, guys here, that the change that triggered this very different way of having to work and communicate and to be in terms of distancing and virtual online working, is it possible that the change and the energy from the change has lessened, but the transition, the bit where we've adjusted to that, it's not really stuck as a new mechanism? Maybe it was a short-lived benefit, if you like, in the positive sense. And maybe we're beginning to see some of the downsides of this new way of being and living, that people are not necessarily getting the balance right in the longer term, which is interesting for the future, because what's the mix going to be as we hopefully the communities and societies come out the other side of a different blended way of working and being. We have to pay more attention maybe to those behaviors that we know we can do, it's been proven, but it's not easy to retain them maybe and to continue them. It's easier to switch back to Brit's point before about not having that time, not having too much focus back on task. And I guess it's a continuous swing, isn't it, between these polarities.
And you mentioned attention, and I think to your point and to Matthew's point about the research that Michael West showed, it all starts also with self-awareness. If you can catch yourself doing a new behavior or a change in behavior, and then ask yourself, how does that make me feel? So pay attention to your attention.
Yes.
That could be one way of embedding the behaviors that will stand you in better stead in
Yes.
future.
Yeah, it's a good point, Brit.
About noticing what you're doing.
And when we're very busy, it's hard to do, right? Because we think we've got a long list of tasks to complete and so on and so forth. The other thing I would add as well is something about perspective taking, because I think a lot of us feel this is unique. This has never happened before, right? Why is it happening to us? And if you look at LinkedIn, if you look at research on Stoicism, for example, if you're into that kind of philosophy, there's something about perspective taking and recognizing that life has hardships, and sometimes one believes that we live in a world where everything should be perfect, and we should have a lot of access to good things and so on and so forth. But I think there's something about recognizing that life isn't like that, which comes maybe through experience. But there's something about taking perspective. So we've had pandemics before. Okay, admittedly, 100 years ago, we've had other difficult situations to cope with. So it feels very real now. Perhaps a pandemic has made us more isolated, which is why it's so important to reconnect, as I think we were saying earlier. Yeah. But it's perhaps also, thinking about how might I put this into perspective, in the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. Yeah. If anything, it makes us feel. And that may be not a bad thing. A pandemic such as this one serves to illustrate that we may not be the all-powerful creatures at the top of the food chain that we sometimes take ourselves to be.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, on that note, I think we've given it a pretty good shot this morning. It's great to see you all, and thanks for joining on the call. And I hope people who see this on YouTube, do get in touch. Do challenge us, do put another point of view, because that's what Let's Talk Leadership is all about. It's just a group of friends and colleagues coming together and trying to put something a little bit back into a part of our world that we've spent a lot of time in and enjoy working in. So see you on another live with Let's Talk Leadership.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Tim, if you're still watching, next time, please join the Zoom call.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thanks, everybody. Great to be here.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Mic on.
Okay, guys.